Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's grandson, lived a hidden life in the underground rough trade. Contracting advanced syphilis and cornered by blackmailers, he shot himself rather than face a forced royal marriage. This is the true story of his death and the ruthless palace cover-up that erased him from history. Born in October 1874 at Buckingham Palace, Alfred Alexander William Ernest Albert was a terrifying concentration of imperial power. He was known within the family as Young Affy. His father was Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, and Queen Victoria's second son. His mother was Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, the daughter of Tsar Alexander II of Russia. When you carry the DNA of the British Empire and the Russian Romanov simultaneously, you are not permitted to be a person. You are a political asset, a geopolitical bridge between the world's premier naval power and its largest land empire. From the moment he drew his first breath, Alfred's entire existence was mapped out. He was the designated heir to the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in Germany. This was no minor provincial title. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was the foundational bloodline of the European establishment, the very dynasty that gave Britain Prince Albert, and by extension, the entire modern British royal family. The late 1890s, the era into which Alfred matured, was the absolute zenith of the Victorian period. It was a time of aggressive, unyielding public morality. The concept of the traditional upright aristocratic gentleman was paramount. Any deviation from strict heterosexual aristocratic norms was not viewed merely as a personal failing. It was considered a national disgrace. Homosexuality was a criminal offense, and it was notoriously weaponized during this exact period, most famously in the devastating trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895. The public destruction of Wilde sent a clear, terrifying message to any man harboring similar secrets. Society would destroy you, strip you of your assets, and lock you in a cell. For a royal heir of Alfred's standing, a scandal of this nature was entirely unthinkable. It would not merely ruin a personal reputation, it had the potential to destabilize the political equilibrium of Europe. Alfred was expected to fulfill the standard rigid template of a royal prince. He was to join the military, marry a suitable, strategically chosen European princess, and produce a legitimate line of healthy heirs. But Alfred possessed a quiet, highly sensitive disposition that immediately clashed with the militaristic expectations of his Prussian and British relatives. Recognizing his apparent lack of robust military zeal, his family pushed him harder. He was thrust into the German army, specifically serving in Potsdam. Potsdam at the end of the 19th century was the beating heart of Prussian militarism. It was a notoriously harsh, hyper-masculine environment, dominated by the rigid Junker class. For a sensitive young man hiding a fundamental truth about his identity, Potsdam was a psychological prison. The aristocratic officer class was defined by strict codes of honor, heavy drinking, and an absolute intolerance for anything deemed weak or effeminate. This intense isolation, combined with the crushing pressure of his imperial pedigree, forged the perfect, tragic conditions for a devastating double life. The official biographies and royal archives gloss over Alfred's time in the military, painting a sanitized picture of a slightly sickly but dutiful prince, fulfilling his obligations. The reality of his life was far darker, far more dangerous, and incredibly desperate. Alienated from the pompous arrogance of the aristocratic officer class, and suffocating under the expectations of two empires, Alfred found his escape in the shadows. He developed a strong preference for what was discreetly known in the vernacular of the time as rough trade. Or, shedding his royal identity, the prince would slip away from his handlers and his commanding officers to explore the hidden working-class taverns and illicit networks of the cities he was stationed in. He sought the company of men who were entirely removed from his gilded, restrictive world. He paid for the company of sailors, infantry soldiers, and street hustlers. In these fleeting transactional encounters, he wasn't the grandson of Queen Victoria. He wasn't the future Duke of Saxe-Coburg. He was simply an anonymous, wealthy patron purchasing a brief window of dangerous freedom. But the late 19th century underworld was an unforgiving environment. There were no safety nets, no discretion guaranteed, and certainly no protections against the physical realities of the era. Through these underground encounters, Prince Alfred contracted syphilis. Today, syphilis is a manageable infection easily cured with a simple course of antibiotics. In the 1890s, it was an absolute death sentence that arrived in slow, agonizing, and deeply humiliating stages. The medical treatments available at the time were often as destructive as the disease itself. Physicians routinely prescribed highly toxic mercury applications, either ingested, applied as ointments, or administered via rudimentary steam baths. These treatments caused catastrophic side effects, including severe tooth loss, acute neurological damage, internal bleeding, and agonizing joint pain. For Prince Alfred, the physical deterioration was a ticking clock that could not be hidden indefinitely. It was a visible, shameful physical manifestation of his secret life. More importantly, it was a condition that could not be explained away to royal physicians without exposing the exact nature of how he contracted it. Tertiary syphilis, the final stage of the disease, famously led to severe dementia, erratic behavior, and visible physical collapse. Alfred knew what awaited him. In the criminal underworld of the Victorian era, a royal client was the ultimate prize. It did not take long for Alfred's companions to realize exactly who was paying for their time. The anonymity he sought was an illusion. Soon, the transactional encounters turned into a systemic, calculated blackmail operation. Men from the lower ranks of society holding deeply incriminating letters, personal effects, and physical evidence of the prince's affairs began to circle the young heir. The threat they presented was explicit and terrifying. Pay the extortion money, or the letters go directly to the press, to the British Parliament, and to the palace in London. The sheer panic this caused within Alfred's inner circle, those few who became aware of the situation, was absolute. A scandal of this magnitude would have completely destroyed his father's reign in the Duchy of Coburg. It would have deeply humiliated Queen Victoria, handing ammunition to the growing anti-monarchy factions in Britain. Furthermore, it would have caused a catastrophic diplomatic incident with Russia, embarrassing the Tsar. The royal machine's response to this crisis was swift, calculated, and entirely merciless. The priority of the establishment was never to protect Alfred's rapidly declining mental state. It was certainly never to seek genuine, compassionate medical help for his fatal condition. The sole priority was to build an impenetrable wall of deniability around the crown. The palace had previously attempted to contain him, briefly pushing him into an engagement with Duchess Elsa of Württemberg years earlier in 1895. But the arrangement quickly collapsed, leaving Alfred increasingly isolated under the judgmental eye of his mother, a fiercely proud Romanov who refused to tolerate any weakness in her son. By early 1899, the situation was entirely out of control. While some historians point to whispers of a targeted blackmail ring in the Berlin underworld closing in on him, the physical reality he faced was undeniable and fatal. Alfred was cornered by his family's suffocating expectations, and heavily cornered by a disease that was rapidly destroying his mind. The neurological decay of tertiary syphilis, combined with the toxic heavy metal treatments he secretly endured, left him in a state of constant paralyzing terror. He was entirely alone. January 1899 arrived. The extended royal family had gathered in force at the Schloss Friedenstein, the Grand Ducal Palace in Gotha. They were there to celebrate a major dynastic milestone, the 25th silver wedding anniversary of Alfred's parents. The palace was filled to the brim with European nobility, senior military figures, endless champagne, and the exact suffocating pageantry that Alfred had spent his short life trying to escape. While the military bands played and the aristocrats raised toasts to the enduring power and legacy of the House of Coburg, the 24-year-old prince retreated from the celebrations to the silence of his private quarters. He had made his final decision. He would not be paraded before the European elite as a healthy, willing groom. He would not participate in the destruction of Duchess Elsa's life to save his own reputation. And he would not allow the blackmailers to systematically dismantle his family's throne piece by piece. Taking a revolver he kept in his rooms, Prince Alfred shot himself in the head. But the tragedy did not end with a clean, immediate death. The gunshot did not kill him instantly. When palace staff, alerted by the noise, breached his rooms, he was found bleeding heavily from a catastrophic head wound. He was severely brain damaged, drifting in and out of consciousness, but he was stubbornly clinging to life. What followed in the immediate hours and days after the gunshot is one of the most chilling, documented examples of royal self-preservation in modern history. The medical staff who treated him initially were sworn to absolute, legally binding secrecy. His parents were horrified. Their horror, however, was not solely directed at the suffering of their only son. They were terrified by the impending monumental scandal. They flatly refused to allow him to die in the Schloss Friedenstein, the very palace where the elite of Europe were currently eating and drinking. Despite his critical, agonizing head wound, it was decided that Alfred had to be removed from the premises immediately. He was quietly bundled out of the castle under the cover of darkness. He was placed on a secure private train and sent far away across the border to the remote Martinsbrunn Sanatorium in Meran, Austria. He was shipped off like damaged, embarrassing cargo. Remarkably, he survived the grueling train journey. He lingered in a state of immense pain and delirium for 2 weeks at the sanatorium. Finally, his body gave out. Prince Alfred died on the 6th of February, 1899. The moment his heart stopped, the grand cover-up began in earnest. Queen Victoria in London, working in tandem with the immense bureaucratic apparatus of the British and German royal households, went to work to rewrite history. The official line released to the public, the courts, and the press was meticulously crafted. It stated that the young prince had died of a tumor. In some sympathetic newspapers, the cause of death was listed as consumption, the contemporary term for tuberculosis. Behind the scenes, the erasure was systematic. The actual medical records detailing his advanced syphilis, the physical evidence of the gunshot wound, and the reports from the doctors at Meran were immediately seized and destroyed. His personal diaries and the vast majority of his private correspondence were burned. His existence was effectively scrubbed from the active royal narrative. The engagement to Duchess Elsa of Württemberg was quietly dissolved and swept under the rug as if it had never occurred. The establishment ensured that Alfred was remembered by the public, if he was remembered at all, as a sickly, fragile young man who passed away tragically early from natural causes. They completely erased the reality of a gay man driven to suicide by the very system meant to protect him. Historians have spent decades attempting to piece together the verifiable truth of Prince Alfred's final days. It is a task made incredibly difficult by the deliberate, state-sanctioned destruction of primary source material. For many decades, official royal biographers simply repeated the palace line, cementing the tumor narrative into accepted historical fact. However, subsequent discoveries in private, unscrubbed archives and the unearthing of candid letters exchanged between minor peripheral royals have completely dismantled the Victorian cover-up. Contemporary historical consensus now universally acknowledges both the suicide and the underlying venereal disease. The debate among modern historians no longer centers on whether he shot himself. The debate focuses on the exact primary catalyst for pulling the trigger. Some medical historians argue that the physical decay and the onset of neurological madness induced by tertiary syphilis removed his rational agency, making the suicide a symptom of the disease rather than a conscious choice. Others contend that the suicide was a sharp, desperate, and entirely lucid act of self-determination. They argue it was the only remaining way he could take control of a narrative that the palace, his domineering mother, and the criminal extortionists were all trying to write for him. Regardless of which interpretation holds more weight, the core historical truth remains undisputed. The Victorian royal establishment created an environment so hostile and unyielding that a young man felt his only escape from his own identity was a bullet. The story of Prince Alfred is not a mere tragic footnote in the sprawling genealogy of Queen Victoria's descendants. And politically, Alfred's violent death permanently altered the course of European history. Because he was the only male heir, his death meant the vital Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha bypassed his direct line. It was eventually forced upon his young cousin, Prince Charles Edward, the Duke of Albany. Charles Edward, thrust into a German role he was unprepared for, would later become a committed, high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, bringing immense shame and complication to the British royal family during the Second World War. Had Alfred lived and inherited the duchy, the political alignment and history of that crucial German territory during the 20th century would have been vastly different. Culturally, Alfred's story serves as a profound indictment of institutional power and the human cost of forced conformity. The Victorian era is frequently romanticized for its elegance, its rapid industrial progress, and its stiff upper lip stoicism. The reality of Alfred's blood on the floor of the Schloss Friedenstein shatters that comfortable illusion. It exposes the sheer brutality of a society that demanded absolute, unquestioning adherence to an impossible moral standard. It reveals a ruling class perfectly willing to sacrifice the lives and sanity of its own children on the altar of public reputation. He was a young man crushed completely between the immense, unyielding weight of imperial expectation and his own desperate need for an authentic life. Queen Victoria and the vast royal establishment succeeded in their immediate, cold-blooded goal. They buried the scandal, they hid the syphilis, and they washed the blood from the succession line. But truth outlasts the institutions that try to suppress it. We do not view Prince Alfred as a disgrace to his lineage. We recognize him as a victim of a profoundly hypocritical system. He did not die because he was inherently flawed. He died because he was trapped in a machine that valued a flawless public facade over human life. His erased history reminds us that the darkest, most damaging secrets of the past are rarely the isolated crimes committed by individuals. They are the brutal, quiet, and highly organized ways in which absolute power covers them up. Prince Alfred's story does not begin in the dark alleys of a German garrison town, nor does it end with the gunshot. It begins decades earlier, forged in the collision of two of the most powerful, unyielding empires the world has ever seen. The blood running through his veins was supposed to be his greatest asset. Instead, it became his ultimate executioner. Young Affi, as he was known before the world stripped him of his boyhood, was the product of a geopolitical transaction disguised as a marriage. His father, Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, was Queen Victoria's second son. The Duke was a naval man, rigid, frequently absent, and carrying the immense expectation of the British monarchy on his shoulders. His mother was Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia, the only surviving daughter of Tsar Alexander II. In the 19th century, a union between the British royal family and the Russian Romanovs was not a matter of romance. It was a merging of superpowers. It was a strategic alliance designed to stabilize Europe, an attempt to bridge the gap between the dominant maritime empire of Britain and the vast, expanding land empire of Russia. But empires do not cuddle their young, and this marriage was famously bitterly unhappy. Grand Duchess Maria arrived in London bearing a dowry so staggering it made the British royals look practically middle class by comparison. She brought with her the absolute, unquestioned autocracy of the Russian court, and she despised England. She hated the damp climate. She hated the food. And above all, she openly resented the fact that as the daughter of a czar, she was expected to yield precedence to the Princess of Wales. Queen Victoria, in turn, found her Russian daughter-in-law haughty, demanding, and impossibly difficult. This was the environment into which young Alfred was born in 1874. He did not grow up in a home. He grew up in a diplomatic battleground. The tension between his parents was a constant freezing undercurrent in the household. His father sought refuge in his naval commands and, later, in heavy drinking. His mother sought refuge in her fierce Russian pride and an overbearing control over her children. For a sensitive boy, this lack of genuine warmth was devastating. He was surrounded by an army of governesses, tutors, and equerries. Yet he was profoundly isolated. His worth was never measured by who he was, but by what he represented. And what he represented was an inheritance that would ultimately crush him. Because his father was Queen Victoria's second son, young Alfred was not destined for the British throne. That burden fell to his uncle, the future King Edward VII. Instead, Alfred was marked from birth for a different, equally heavy crown. He was the designated heir to the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in the German Empire. To modern ears, a German duchy might sound like a minor provincial title. In the late 19th century, it was anything but. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was the very bedrock of European royalty. This was the dynasty of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's beloved late husband. It was the bloodline that had systematically married into nearly every major royal house across the continent. To inherit Coburg was to inherit the sacred ancestral homeland of the modern British monarchy. The current Duke, Ernest II, was childless. Therefore, the succession passed to the British line, to Alfred's father, and then directly to young Afy. Knowing this fate awaited him, his education and upbringing were entirely hijacked by the demands of the German throne. He was not allowed the relatively freer, more sporting life of an English aristocrat. From a very young age, he was systematically groomed to be a German ruler. This meant stripping away any perceived British softness and replacing it with Prussian discipline. It was a brutal cultural pivot. The Victorian era, particularly in its later decades, was obsessed with a very specific, rigid brand of masculinity. The ideal man was stoic, militaristic, and entirely unemotional. Any display of sensitivity, artistic inclination, or gentleness was viewed with deep suspicion and actively stamped out. For young Alfred, who possessed a naturally quiet and introspective disposition, this environment was a psychological torture chamber. He did not possess the boisterous, commanding presence of his British cousins, nor did he share his father's gruff naval hardiness. He was a boy who needed guidance and empathy, but he was given only duty and discipline. As he entered his teenage years, the reality of his future began to close in around him. The family relocated to Germany to prepare for his father's eventual accession to the duchy. Leaving behind the familiar if cold walls of Clarence House in London, Alfred was thrust into the highly conservative, rigidly formal courts of Coburg and Gotha. Here, the shadow of his grandfather, Prince Albert, loomed over everything. The expectations were absolute. He was to master the German language, integrate seamlessly into the German aristocracy, and most importantly, prepare for a high-ranking career in the German imperial military. This military expectation was the fatal catalyst. In the German Empire, a prince could not simply be a civilian ruler, he had to be a soldier. Alfred was pushed into the Prussian military system, a machine designed to break down individuality and rebuild men into unthinking components of the state. He was eventually stationed in Potsdam, the elite military garrison town outside Berlin. Potsdam was the epicenter of hyper-masculine, aristocratic culture. The young officers were drawn from the highest ranks of the German nobility, the Junkers. Their lives revolved around exhaustive military drills, strict codes of honor, dueling, and aggressive heavy drinking. It was an environment that demanded absolute conformity and brutally punished anyone who failed to fit the mold. For Alfred, already alienated from his parents and isolated by his dual heritage, Potsdam was a nightmare. He was an outsider, too English for the Germans, too Russian for the English, and too sensitive for the military. He found himself trapped in a uniform he despised, surrounded by men who would never understand him, and facing a future that had been decided before he was even born. The pressure to project an image of robust, heterosexual, aristocratic strength was relentless. Every movement, every word, every public appearance was scrutinized by handlers whose sole job was to ensure he did not embarrass the crown. He was not a human being. He was an institution in a beautifully tailored uniform. It is in this profound isolation, this desperate, suffocating loneliness, that the cracks began to form. When the world demands you be something you fundamentally are not, and when that demand is backed by the weight of two empires, the human mind searches for an escape valve. It searches for a place where the mask can finally slip. For Prince Alfred, surrounded by the elite of Europe but starving for authentic connection, that escape would not be found in the glittering ballrooms of Berlin or the drawing rooms of London. It would be found in the shadows, far below the rigid class structures that bound him. He began to look downwards into a dangerous hidden world where a prince could disappear and where a man could finally breathe. But the air in that underground world was toxic, and the price of entry would eventually cost him his life. The air in the underground world of late 19th century Germany was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco, spilled beer, and the unwashed wool of infantry uniforms. It was a world entirely foreign to the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace or the rigidly formal drawing rooms of Coburg. Yet, for Prince Alfred, this damp, dimly lit underbelly became his only sanctuary. When you spend your entire waking life performing a role for an audience of millions, the greatest luxury money can buy is anonymity. And so, the grandson of Queen Victoria slipped into the shadows, seeking the one thing his royal pedigree could not command: genuine, unvarnished human contact. Within the brutal realities of the Victorian class system, every aristocratic interaction was a chess move. Friendships were political alliances, marriages were territorial acquisitions, and even casual conversations were strictly monitored by courtiers. There was no room for vulnerability. Driven to the edge of despair by this suffocating isolation, Alfred sought out men who were completely detached from his world. He ventured into the working-class districts, the docks, and the hidden taverns, frequented by off-duty soldiers and rough sailors. These were men whose lives were defined by hard physical labor and meager wages. They did not care about the geopolitical implications of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. They cared about the coins sliding across the table. For Alfred, there was a profound tragic relief in this transactional honesty. In the arms of a dock worker or a cavalryman, he was not a prince burdened by the expectations of two empires. He was just another man in the dark. But maintaining a double life when you are one of the most recognizable and heavily guarded young men in Europe is an incredibly dangerous logistical nightmare. Alfred was constantly flanked by equerries, military aides, and royal detectives whose sole purpose was to protect the crown's asset. To escape, he had to rely on a dangerous combination of bribery, deception, and the blind eyes of loyal or highly compromised valets. He would exchange his immaculate military uniforms for plain, nondescript civilian clothes, slipping out through servants' entrances and vanishing into the labyrinthine streets of Berlin and Potsdam. The adrenaline of these escapes must have been intoxicating, a sharp contrast to the numb, mechanical routine of his official duties. But the dread was equally potent. The German Empire, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, was a heavily policed state with a vast network of informants. The infamous paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code made homosexual acts explicitly illegal, punishable by severe imprisonment and total social ruin. Alfred was playing a game of Russian roulette with the reputation of the entire British and German royal establishments. Every time he stepped out of the palace doors, he risked bringing down a catastrophe that would eclipse any war or diplomatic failure. It was in these unregulated, precarious environments that the inevitable consequence of his rebellion took root. The late 19th century was an era largely defenseless against invisible enemies. While the upper classes obsessed over moral purity, the actual physical realities of urban life were rife with danger. Through his encounters in the shadows, Prince Alfred contracted syphilis. To modern audiences, a syphilis diagnosis is a minor inconvenience, easily eradicated with a standard dose of penicillin. In the 1890s, however, it was a terrifying, relentless death sentence. It was a disease that carried not only immense physical agony, but an absolute insurmountable social stigma. It was viewed not merely as a medical failing, but as a profound moral corruption, a physical rot that mirrored a sinful soul. For a royal prince whose physical body was considered an extension of the state's health and divine right, such a disease was an unthinkable disgrace. The progression of syphilis in the pre-antibiotic era was notoriously cruel. It began quietly, often with a single painless mark that would eventually vanish, tricking the victim into a false sense of security. But the bacteria would then move silently into the bloodstream, establishing a permanent destructive presence. The secondary stage brought fevers, debilitating exhaustion, and severe rashes that were incredibly difficult to conceal from the prying eyes of valets and military doctors. Alfred found himself fighting a war on two fronts, hiding his sexuality from the world and now hiding a rotting disease from his own household. The terror of this reality must have been absolute. He could not turn to the official royal physicians. To do so would require an explanation of how he contracted the illness, forcing a confession that would immediately be reported back to his parents and inevitably to Queen Victoria herself. Instead, he was forced to seek out discreet private doctors who specialized in treating the embarrassing ailments of the wealthy. The cures offered by these doctors were frequently as barbaric and destructive as the disease itself. The standard medical protocol of the era was based on heavy metal toxicity. The phrase, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," was the grim reality for thousands. Alfred was subjected to aggressive mercury treatments. He would have ingested toxic pills, endured painful injections, and sat in rudimentary steam cabinets designed to force the mercury into his system. These treatments systematically poisoned the patient. The side effects were grotesque and agonizing. Patients suffered from acute neurological tremors. Their teeth loosened and fell out. Their gums bled constantly, and their breath took on a distinct metallic foulness. The physical pain was excruciating, leaving the sufferer heavily reliant on morphine and alcohol just to function. As Alfred attempted to maintain the rigid posture required of a Prussian officer on the parade ground, he was literally falling apart from the inside out. Every public appearance became a grueling test of endurance. Every smile was forced through the haze of heavy metal poisoning and chronic pain. As his physical condition deteriorated, his psychological defenses began to crumble. The isolation that had driven him to the underworld in the first place now deepened into profound paranoia. He could trust no one. The men he drank with in the officers' mess would destroy him if they knew the truth. His family would disown him, viewing him not as a suffering son, but as a defective heir who had compromised the bloodline. He was trapped in a decaying body, surrounded by people who demanded perfection. And then, the final fatal complication emerged. The anonymity he had so desperately sought in the taverns and brothels evaporated. The underworld is an ecosystem built on leverage and opportunism. It did not take long for the men he paid for company to realize that their wealthy, quiet patron was not merely a wealthy aristocrat, but the grandson of the British Queen. The shift in power was immediate and terrifying. Alfred was no longer the patron in control of the transaction. He had become prey. The tokens of affection he had foolishly handed out, the hastily scribbled notes, the deeply incriminating letters, these items ceased to be romantic secrets and transformed into weapons of mass destruction. Men who lived on the margins of society suddenly held the keys to the kingdom. They began to make their demands known. It started with subtle requests for loans, favors that could not be refused. But as Alfred's desperation grew, so did the audacity of his extortionists. The threats became explicit. They demanded vast sums of money, threatening to deliver the letters directly to the Kaiser's chancellery, to the editors of the most ruthless newspapers in London and Berlin, and straight to the desk of his father, the Duke of Coburg. Alfred was hemorrhaging money to keep them quiet, but extortion is a beast that is never fully fed. Every payment merely confirmed his vulnerability and invited a higher demand. He was caught in an agonizing vice. On one side, a fatal disease was eating away at his body and his mind. On the other side, a network of ruthless blackmailers was systematically dismantling his life, threatening to trigger a scandal that would bring the royal houses of Europe crashing down upon his head. The walls of the palace were no longer a prison. They were rapidly becoming a tomb. He needed a miracle, or he needed an exit. What his family offered him instead was a wife. The royal establishment did not operate on empathy. It operated on a mechanism of ruthless containment. When rumors finally began to circulate about the heir to the Coburg throne, whispers of massive unexplained debts, unsavory associates, and a sickly, deteriorating physical appearance, the palace did not offer medical intervention or psychological support. They deployed a strategy older than the monarchy itself. In the late 19th century, the ultimate cure for a young prince's wayward reputation was not a doctor, it was a bride. To the senior courtiers and family matriarchs in London and Germany, marriage was never a matter of personal affection. It was a diplomatic instrument, a method of cementing geopolitical alliances, and crucially, a highly effective public relations shield. A prominent royal wedding would dominate the newspapers, projecting a unified image of stability, virility, and dynastic continuity. It would forcefully extract Alfred from his bachelor quarters in Potsdam, pulling him back into the heavily monitored, strictly regulated environment of a marital household. Most importantly, it would instantly silence the insidious rumors about his private life. The plan was brutally pragmatic: bury the impending scandal under the overwhelming spectacle of a royal wedding. The search for a suitable candidate was conducted with the cold, calculating efficiency of a military campaign. The establishment needed a woman of impeccable aristocratic pedigree, someone whose family standing would reinforce the prestige of the Coburg dynasty without overshadowing it. The palace aggressively began scouting for a suitable European princess. The chosen candidate would not be viewed as a human being with her own hopes, but as a tactical deployment. She would serve as a lavender screen, designed specifically to stand between Prince Alfred's sordid reality and the judging eyes of the public. For Alfred, the announcement of this arranged engagement was not a lifeline. It was a death blow to his remaining conscience. To understand his actions, we must look at the psychological agony of his specific position. He was a man slowly decaying from advanced, untreated syphilis. His central nervous system was being actively eroded by the disease and the toxic, heavy metal mercury treatments he secretly ingested to suppress the visible symptoms. His personal finances were entirely drained by an escalating network of extortionists holding letters that could destroy his family's standing in two empires. He was living in a state of constant, paralyzing terror. Yet despite this immense pressure and his physical collapse, a fundamental sense of morality remained intact within him. The idea of standing at an altar and binding a healthy, innocent young woman to a dying man physically repulsed him. He knew exactly what the marriage would entail. As the heir, he would be explicitly expected to produce a legitimate child. Engaging in that act would almost certainly infect Duchess Elsa with syphilis, condemning her to the exact same agonizing, humiliating death he was currently suffering. He would have to lock her in a loveless, fraudulent union, turning her entire life into a gilded prison simply to protect the public image of his parents. It was a line he could not bring himself to cross. The pressure from his family to conform, however, was absolute. His mother, Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, was a formidable Romanov who brooked zero defiance. She demanded perfection and total obedience, oblivious to or willfully ignoring the physical reality of her son's collapse. She viewed his hesitance and sudden bouts of melancholy not as a moral stand or a medical crisis, but as an embarrassing weakness that needed to be bullied out of him. The machinery of the state began to churn, demanding an impending grand European wedding that would definitively trap him. Simultaneously, the criminal extortion ring closed its grip. The men holding Alfred's letters and physical evidence saw the impending royal wedding not as a deterrent, but as an unprecedented financial opportunity. A married prince, heavily invested in projecting an image of traditional family values, has infinitely more to lose than a single cavalry officer living in a garrison town. The price for their silence skyrocketed. The demands for cash became far more aggressive, accompanied by strict, non-negotiable deadlines. The blackmailers knew they had cornered the heir to the Coburg throne, and they fully intended to bleed him dry. Alfred was entirely out of options. He could not confess the blackmail to the palace authorities. Doing so would require producing the letters and, by extension, confessing his homosexuality and his venereal disease to a family that would likely view him as a criminal. He could not run. The royal detectives monitoring his movements and his own failing, painful body made physical escape impossible. And he could not go through with a forced marriage. His conscience drew a hard, unyielding line at destroying an innocent bride to save himself. This was the terrifying reality as the calendar turned to January 1899. The entire extended royal apparatus began to converge on the Grand Ducal Palace in Gotha, the Schloss Friedenstein. They were gathering for a massive celebration to mark the 25th silver wedding anniversary of Alfred's parents. It was an event meticulously designed to project the absolute unshakable power of the Saxe-Coburg and Romanov dynasties. The guest list included the highest-ranking aristocrats, diplomats, and military commanders in Europe. For the palace, it was a triumph of pageantry and power projection. For Alfred, it was the construction of his final stage. He was dragged to Gotha, forced into his immaculate heavy military dress uniforms, and ordered to perform his role as the dutiful, engaged heir. Every banquet, every prolonged toast, every public appearance required him to smile through the haze of heavy metal poisoning, chronic physical agony, and the sheer blinding panic of his impending ruin. The extortionist deadlines were looming closer. The threat of a forced marriage was approaching rapidly. The physical rot of the syphilis was advancing into its final, visible stages. Surrounded by hundreds of guests celebrating a dynastic marriage that had defined his own miserable existence, the prince realized the trap had fully snapped shut. The institution that had bred him would not save him. It would only use him to maintain its facade until there was nothing left. And then it would quietly discard the pieces. He was entirely alone in a massive castle filled with his own family. The only way to stop the blackmail, to definitively save an innocent bride from infection, and to escape the prolonged, agonizing death of tertiary syphilis, was to take definitive control of the one thing the royal establishment had not yet managed to regulate. The contrast between the events unfolding on the upper floors of the Schloss Friedenstein and the glittering spectacle in the staterooms below is one of the most chilling juxtapositions in modern royal history. It was late January 1899. Downstairs, the elite of the German and British empires were engaged in a heavily orchestrated celebration of dynastic endurance. The silver wedding anniversary of the Duke of Edinburgh and the Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna was a highly public reaffirmation of the alliance between Queen Victoria and the Romanovs. Orchestras played waltzes, champagne flowed in endless quantities, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and heavy floral arrangements. Upstairs, far removed from the music and the toasts, the 24-year-old heir to the throne stood alone in his private apartments. He was dressed in the impeccable restrictive uniform of a Prussian officer, the very symbol of the rigid establishment that had slowly suffocated him. We can only imagine the profound, isolating terror of those final moments. Prince Alfred was a man completely broken by a fatal rotting disease, hunted by ruthless extortionists from the Berlin underworld, and cornered by his own family into a fraudulent marriage that would destroy an innocent woman. He saw no other exit. Taking a heavy caliber revolver, he raised it to his head and pulled the trigger. If history were a neat, predictable narrative, that single gunshot would have ended his suffering instantly. But reality is rarely clean. The bullet did not kill him. Instead, it tore through his skull, causing catastrophic trauma, immense blood loss, and severe brain damage, but leaving him agonizingly, stubbornly alive. The immediate aftermath of the gunshot was a masterclass in aristocratic panic and ruthless synchronized containment. When the muffled crack of the revolver echoed through the upper corridors, it was not followed by a public outcry or a frantic call for local police. The royal household operated like an autonomous state. Trusted equerries and highly vetted valets were the first to breach the heavy oak doors of the prince's quarters. What they found was a scene of absolute horror, the golden boy of the Coburg dynasty bleeding out on the floorboards, his uniform ruined, barely clinging to life. The reaction of his parents when they were discreetly pulled away from their anniversary celebrations and informed of the bloodbath upstairs tells you everything you need to know about the priorities of the late Victorian monarchy. There was undoubtedly shock and perhaps a twisted proprietary form of grief, but the overriding, immediate, and absolute emotion was sheer terror. It was not terror for the excruciating pain their son was experiencing. It was terror for the crown. If word leaked that the heir had attempted to blow his own brains out while the most powerful aristocrats in Europe were eating caviar downstairs, the resulting scandal would be apocalyptic. The rumors of his massive debts, his sudden physical decline, and his unsavory companions would instantly detonate into a public inquiry. The blackmailers waiting in the wings would have all the confirmation they needed to release his letters to the press. The marriage alliance with Württemberg would collapse in utter humiliation. Therefore, the immediate medical intervention was entirely secondary to the political intervention. The royal physicians, men accustomed to treating the gout and mild fevers of the nobility, were hastily summoned and immediately sworn to absolute legally binding secrecy. They were ordered to stabilize the prince, but they were severely restricted in who they could consult and what resources they could use. The priority was keeping the door locked and the music playing downstairs. For days, a grotesque pantomime played out within the Schloss Friedenstein. While Prince Alfred drifted in and out of consciousness in a locked room, his head heavily bandaged, suffering from unimaginable agony and the advancing neurological rot of his untreated syphilis, his parents continued to host their anniversary guests. The Duke and the Grand Duchess fixed smiles to their faces, attended banquets, and accepted the congratulations of their peers, all while knowing their only son was bleeding into his sheets just a few floors above. It was a display of cold-blooded institutional discipline that is almost impossible to comprehend today. But as the days dragged on, a terrifying logistical reality set in. The doctors confessed that the prince's wounds were likely fatal, but his young heart was strong. He could linger for weeks. He could not, under any circumstances, be allowed to die in the Schloss Friedenstein. If the heir died violently in the palace during a major gathering, an official state funeral would be required immediately. Inquests would have to be held. The body would have to be viewed. The lie could not hold up under that level of intense localized scrutiny. The solution the family arrived at is one of the darkest indictments of the royal establishment. They decided that a critically wounded, brain-damaged man who was actively dying from a self-inflicted gunshot wound had to be physically removed from the premises. He had to be hidden. Under the cover of darkness in the freezing cold of a German winter, the bruised and broken body of Prince Alfred was smuggled out of his ancestral home. The logistics of this operation were staggering. Valets and trusted guards moved him through servant corridors and out of discreet side entrances to avoid the lingering anniversary guests. He was loaded into a carriage and transported to a secure, private train waiting at a secluded siding. His destination was the Martinsbrunn Sanatorium in Meran, a town nestled high in the Austrian Tyrol. Meran was renowned as a discreet retreat for the wealthy European elite suffering from nervous exhaustion or the final stages of tuberculosis. More importantly, it was hundreds of miles away from Gotha, safely outside the jurisdiction of the Coburg court, and heavily insulated from the prying eyes of the Berlin press. The train journey from Gotha to Austria took hours. For a healthy traveler, it was a scenic route. For Prince Alfred, it must have been a descent into absolute hell. Every jolt of the carriages on the iron rails would have sent waves of searing pain through his shattered skull. He was accompanied only by a skeleton crew of tight-lipped doctors and guards, whose primary duty was not to comfort him, but to ensure he remained unseen. His parents did not travel with him. They remained in Germany to manage the narrative and conclude the anniversary celebrations. They essentially packed their dying son into a box and shipped him across a border to ensure his final breaths would not embarrass them. When the train finally arrived in Meran, the prince was quietly unloaded and taken to the sanatorium. The Martinsbrunn was an elegant facility surrounded by snow-capped mountains and crisp, cold air. But for Alfred, it was merely an exceptionally expensive waiting room for death. He was placed under heavy guard. The medical staff at the facility were given strict, non-negotiable instructions regarding his treatment and the absolute confidentiality of his condition. He lingered in this remote, isolated facility for 2 agonizing weeks. We do not have his final words. The Royal Archives ensured that any letters or medical notes generated during this period were meticulously destroyed. We only know that he was entirely alone, stripped of his titles, his future, and ultimately his identity. The establishment had successfully excised him from their world. He was no longer a prince, he was a problem that was slowly, conveniently solving itself. On the 6th of February, 1899, the battered heart of Prince Alfred finally gave out. He died in a foreign country, hidden away in a sanatorium, surrounded by strangers paid to keep their mouths shut. He was 24 years old. The moment he drew his last breath, the agonizing human tragedy ended, and the cold, mechanical process of historical erasure began. The crisis of his survival was over. Now the palace had to manage the crisis of his death. The telegrams that flashed across the telegraph wires of Europe on the morning of February 6th, 1899, were masterpieces of institutional fiction. When the news of Prince Alfred's death broke from the remote sanatorium in Meran, the royal establishment did not pause to mourn. They immediately shifted into a state of aggressive crisis management. The narrative had to be seized and locked down before the European press could catch wind of the blood, the gunshot, or the sordid underworld connections that had led to it all. Queen Victoria, sitting in the winter chill of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, was 80 years old. She had spent over 6 decades managing the sprawling, often volatile apparatus of the British monarchy. She was no stranger to family tragedy or scandal, but the sheer violent ugliness of her grandson's end threatened the very moral foundation she had built her era upon. Her response and the response of her advisers was devoid of sentimentality. The priority was the preservation of the crown's dignity. The immediate task was the fabrication of a medical consensus. The doctors who had attended the prince in Meran were highly compensated professionals, fully aware that their continued livelihood depended on their absolute discretion. Under the direct instruction of the palace, official medical bulletins were drafted and released to the international press. The court circulars announced that the young heir to the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha throne had succumbed to a long-standing illness. The cause of death was officially recorded and distributed as a malignant tumor, or, in some sympathetic British papers, a severe case of consumption that had violently attacked his brain. The compliance of the press in this era was crucial, and the palace relied heavily on the unwritten rules of aristocratic deference. Major broadsheets like the Times in London and the state-aligned newspapers in Berlin printed the court's official statements without a hint of journalistic skepticism. They published lengthy, mournful obituaries praising the young prince's stoicism in the face of his tragic natural decline. The gunshot was never mentioned. The syphilis was erased. The existence of the blackmailers was buried. The public was fed a sanitized, acceptable tragedy, a sickly young royal taken before his time. But while the newspapers printed lies, the physical machinery of the state was executing a massive silent purge of the truth. Back in the Schloss Friedenstein, in Gotha, and in Alfred's private quarters in Potsdam, trusted equerries and royal fixers were deployed with a single, ruthless objective: destroy everything. Fires burned in the grates of the grand ducal palaces deep into the night. Every piece of personal correspondence belonging to the prince, every diary entry, every scrap of paper that could even hint at his double life, his sexuality, or his financial desperation was thrown into the flames. The medical records from the garrison doctors in Germany, the men who had administered the agonizing mercury treatments, were confiscated and incinerated. The establishment was not merely covering up a suicide. They were methodically erasing the prince's authentic self from the historical record. If there was no paper trail, there was no proof. If there was no proof, the palace narrative became the undisputed truth. Then came the delicate, dangerous matter of the Berlin extortionists. The men who had driven Alfred to put a gun to his head were still out there, and they still possessed the highly incriminating letters and physical evidence of the prince's illicit affairs. The palace could not use the official police force to arrest them. A public trial would expose the very secrets they were trying to hide. Instead, the royal household operated like a shadow government. Utilizing slush funds and discreet agents, they tracked down the blackmailers in the criminal underworld. The resulting transactions were the ultimate exercise in aristocratic pragmatism. The extortionists were not punished for driving a royal heir to his death. They were paid off. Staggering sums of quiet money exchanged hands in the dark corners of Berlin and London to secure the return of the prince's letters. Once the evidence was surrendered, it was immediately destroyed. The establishment essentially used the immense wealth of the state to fund a criminal cover-up, buying silence from the very men who had preyed upon their son. The physical reality of the prince's body also presented a problem. A state funeral was required by protocol, but the family could not risk an open casket or a prolonged public viewing. The trauma of the gunshot wound to the head, despite the efforts of morticians, could not be completely hidden. Furthermore, the physical ravages of advanced syphilis on his body would have been impossible to explain away to the attending nobility. Consequently, Prince Alfred's remains were sealed in a heavy lead coffin almost immediately. When the body was returned to Gotha for burial, the pageantry was immense, but the grief on display was hollow and performative. The European elite gathered once more, dressing in heavy mourning black to stand over a closed box. His father, the Duke of Edinburgh, was visibly broken, a man whose ambition for his dynasty had literally killed his only son. His mother, the formidable Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, maintained an icy, impenetrable stoicism. To the watching world, it was a dignified royal farewell. In reality, it was the final successful stage of an elaborate cover-up. The establishment was burying the evidence. Any plans for a forced royal marriage were quietly dissolved. The anonymous princess intended to serve as Alfred's lavender screen was spared the horror of a fraudulent union and the inevitable transmission of a fatal venereal disease, simply moved off the board as a pawn no longer required. However, you cannot remove a keystone from an arch without causing a structural collapse, and the death of Prince Alfred triggered an immediate, catastrophic geopolitical crisis. The Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was not merely a ceremonial title, it was a functioning German state and a vital strategic anchor for the British royal family within the German Empire. By the strict laws of succession, the throne could only pass through the male line. Prince Alfred was his father's only son. His death meant the direct line was severed. The immediate heir was now Queen Victoria's third son, Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught. But Arthur was a fiercely dedicated British soldier. He had no desire to renounce his British citizenship, uproot his family, and rule over a minor German state in an era of rapidly increasing tension between London and Berlin. He flatly refused the inheritance. His own son, Prince Arthur of Connaught, also formally renounced his claim. The British royals were actively dodging the Coburg throne, viewing it as a poisoned chalice. The crisis deepened. The line of succession fell to the next available male heir, Queen Victoria's fourth son, Prince Leopold, the Duke of Albany. But Leopold was dead, having passed away years earlier from hemophilia. He had, however, left behind a son. This is where the tragedy of Prince Alfred ceases to be a mere Victorian scandal and becomes a direct catalyst for the darkest chapter in 20th century royal history. The new heir to the vital German duchy was Leopold's son, young Prince Charles Edward, the current Duke of Albany. At the time of Alfred's suicide, Charles Edward was a thoroughly English schoolboy attending Eton, completely disconnected from German culture, politics, or language. He was a British royal through and through. Yet because Alfred had put a bullet in his head, this unprepared English teenager was abruptly yanked from his life at Eton. By the direct command of Queen Victoria and Kaiser Wilhelm II, Charles Edward was ordered to move to Germany, strip away his British identity, and prepare to take over the Duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The boy was completely isolated, thrust into the same rigid, unforgiving Prussian military environment that had broken his cousin Alfred. Charles Edward, desperate to prove his loyalty to his new country and terrified of appearing as an English outsider, overcompensated violently. He embraced German nationalism with a zealot's fervor. Decades later, when the First World War tore Europe apart, Charles Edward fought for Germany, leading to his public disgrace in Britain and the stripping of his British titles. But his radicalization did not stop there. Embittered, stripped of his English heritage, and thoroughly indoctrinated by far-right German politics, the man who inherited Prince Alfred's throne made a fatal choice in the 1930s. He became one of the earliest, most prominent aristocratic supporters of Adolf Hitler. Charles Edward joined the Nazi Party, utilizing the immense prestige of the Saxe-Coburg name to legitimize the fascist regime to the international community. He became a high-ranking officer in the SA and a committed architect of the Nazi state, bringing an indelible permanent stain of shame upon the wider British royal family. This is the true historical weight of the cover-up. The gunshot in the Schloss Friedenstein did not just end a single life, it forcibly shifted the tectonic plates of the European succession. It removed a man who, despite his immense personal flaws and tragic circumstances, had no political ambitions beyond his own survival, and replaced him with a highly malleable child who would eventually hand the ancestral home of the British monarchy over to the Third Reich. The establishment's desperate need to cover up a scandal of sexuality and disease inadvertently paved the way for a scandal of fascism and genocide. For nearly a century, the lie held, the Victorian royal establishment had executed a masterclass in historical erasure, and their fabricated narrative of a young prince struck down by a tragic natural tumor became accepted fact. Official biographers of the British and German royal families dutifully repeated the court circulars. Encyclopedias recorded his death as a footnote of medical misfortune. The House of Windsor, which evolved from the Saxe-Coburg line, and the remaining German nobility successfully projected an image of dignified grief over a blameless tragedy. Prince Alfred was buried, and the horrific reality of his final months was buried alongside him. But a cover-up of that magnitude is never truly seamless. You can order valets to scrub blood from the floorboards of the Schloss Friedenstein, and you can burn every letter in a young man's desk, but you cannot easily control the memories of the hundreds of peripheral actors required to execute the deception. The sheer logistics of smuggling a brain-damaged, dying heir across international borders required train conductors, border guards, junior medical staff, and carriage drivers. Furthermore, the extortionists in the Berlin underworld had been paid off, but criminal syndicates are not known for their eternal discretion. Whispers began almost immediately. These whispers, however, were rigidly confined to the shadows. In the strict deferential society of the early 20th century, no mainstream newspaper would dare publish unverified gossip that accused the grandson of Queen Victoria of homosexuality, venereal disease, and suicide. To do so would invite crippling libel lawsuits and the immediate destruction of the publication by the state. The truth was trapped in a holding pattern, surviving only in closed-door conversations among the European elite and the cynical files of foreign intelligence services. It was not until the late 20th century, as the deferential culture surrounding the monarchy began to erode and modern historical methodology took hold, that the facade finally cracked. Historians attempting to write comprehensive biographies of the Victorian era began to notice glaring inconsistencies in the official records surrounding Prince Alfred. The narrative simply did not make sense. The timeline of his rapid physical decline contradicted the slow progression of a brain tumor. The sudden, highly secretive transport to a remote Austrian sanatorium while he was allegedly in the final stages of a natural illness defied all standard medical logic of the era. Most suspiciously, the complete lack of any surviving personal correspondence from the prince during his final year was a massive red flag to any trained archivist. A royal prince does not simply stop writing letters unless someone else has deliberately destroyed them. Realizing that the central royal archives at Windsor and Coburg had been thoroughly sanitized, investigative historians changed their tactics. They stopped looking at the official center of power and began looking at the margins. They bypassed the scrubbed family papers and started digging into the archives of foreign embassies. Diplomats in the 1890s were essentially highly paid spies. The French, Russian, and Austrian ambassadors stationed in Berlin and London were tasked with reporting the unvarnished truth back to their respective governments, and they had no loyalty to the public image of the Coburg dynasty. When historians unsealed the encrypted diplomatic dispatches from January and February 1899, they found the smoking gun. Ambassadors had sent confidential cables detailing the sudden, violent gunshot in Gotha, the frantic cover-up, and the heavily rumored diagnosis of advanced syphilis. They viewed the palace's official tumor narrative with openly documented contempt. The truth was further corroborated by the discovery of private letters exchanged between minor, peripheral members of the extended royal family. Relatives who were not directly involved in the central management of the crown, but who were present at the silver wedding anniversary in Gotha, had written candidly to their own trusted confidants about the blood and the panic they had witnessed. Because these individuals were considered historically insignificant, their private papers had escaped the palace's purge. Slowly, agonizingly, piece by piece, the ghost of Prince Alfred was pulled back from the ashes. This historical unearthing fundamentally shifted the debate. The question was no longer whether the establishment had lied. That was now an established, undeniable fact. The debate among modern historians centered entirely on the exact catalyst for the suicide. They sought to understand the specific psychological breaking point of a man who had everything to lose. Some medical historians focus heavily on the pathology of tertiary syphilis. In its final stages, the disease physically destroys the brain tissue, leading to severe dementia, terrifying hallucinations, and profound personality changes. Combined with the neurological damage caused by toxic mercury treatments. They argue that Prince Alfred may have been entirely stripped of his rational agency by the time he picked up the revolver. In this interpretation, the gunshot was not a calculated decision, but the tragic, desperate reflex of a mind literally being eaten away by infection. However, many political and social historians strongly contest this view. They argue that attributing the suicide solely to medical insanity inadvertently minimizes the profound calculated cruelty of the royal establishment and the extortionists. They point to the timing of the suicide. It did not happen randomly. It happened on the exact weekend his entire family was gathered, just as the demands of the blackmailers reached their peak, and right as the fraudulent marriage to Duchess Elsa was being finalized. This camp argues that the suicide was a sharp, desperately lucid act of self-determination. Alfred realized he was trapped in an impossible crossfire. He could not stop the physical rot of his disease. He could not pay off the criminal underworld indefinitely without bankrupting his estate. And he could not subject an innocent woman to a fatal infection to save his parents' public image. The gunshot was his only remaining assertion of control over a life that had been entirely dictated by the state since birth. It was a violent rejection of the system that demanded he suffer in silence for the good of the crown. The revelation of this truth forces a complete reevaluation of the Victorian monarchy. The era is relentlessly sold to the public as a golden age of morality, duty, and stoic imperial grace. Queen Victoria is venerated as the ultimate matriarch, but the reality of how her establishment handled Prince Alfred exposes a chilling ruthlessness. The monarchy was not a family bound by unconditional love. It was a geopolitical syndicate utterly obsessed with its own survival. They possessed immense wealth and unmatched global influence, yet they could not or would not save their own heir. When his private reality clashed with their required public image, they did not offer medical intervention or protection from the criminal underworld. They offered him a fraudulent marriage to hide behind, and when that failed, they let him bleed out, packed him onto a train, and erased his name from history. The loyalty of the institution was never to the individual. The loyalty was exclusively to the crown. This realization strips away the velvet curtains of the palace. It demands that we look at the historical figures not as divine rulers, but as flawed, deeply compromised human beings operating a ruthless machine. The tragedy of Prince Alfred is no longer a story of a royal failing to meet expectations. It is the story of an institution failing its most fundamental human obligations. The boy who was supposed to inherit the heart of the European establishment became its most tragic casualty, crushed entirely by the very power he was born to wield. To fully grasp the sheer futility of the establishment's cruelty, we must look at what happened to the people who orchestrated the cover-up. The royal machine that destroyed Prince Alfred did not buy itself immortality. It merely bought a temporary, hollow delay of its own collapse. The tragedy of the erased heir is amplified tenfold when you realize that the institutions his family sacrificed him to protect were entirely obliterated within a single generation. His father, the Duke of Edinburgh, the man who prioritized his dynastic ambition and public standing over his son's survival, was completely broken by the suicide. The stress, the guilt, and the sheer effort required to maintain the lie of the tumor accelerated his own physical decline. He developed severe throat cancer and died in the late summer of 1900, barely 18 months after his son bled out in Moran. The Coburg dynasty he had dedicated his life to securing for his direct line evaporated in an instant. He died knowing that his only male heir had killed himself to escape the life he had built for him. His mother, the formidable Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna, who had bullied her son toward a fraudulent marriage and maintained an icy stoicism throughout the cover-up, lived to see her entire world turn to ash. She survived until 1920. She lived long enough to witness the First World War destroy the German Empire that Alfred was supposed to rule. More devastatingly, she lived to see the Russian Revolution completely annihilate the Romanov dynasty she was so fiercely proud of. Her brothers, her nephews, and her extended family were lined up in cellars and executed by the Bolsheviks. The absolute autocracy she had wielded like a weapon in her own household was wiped from the face of the earth. The power structures they had protected with such cold-blooded efficiency ultimately could not even protect themselves. Today, the physical remnants of this history are deceptively peaceful. You can visit the Schloss Friedenstein in Gotha. You can walk the same grand, echoing hallways where the European elite gathered for the silver wedding anniversary. And you can stand beneath the same ornate ceilings that absorb the sound of a heavy caliber revolver. But you will find no plaque acknowledging the profound agony of Prince Alfred. You can travel to Meran, to the site of the sanatorium where he spent his final weeks in forced exile, and you will find nothing but clean mountain air and historical silence. The Victorian establishment was incredibly efficient at building towering monuments to their military and political victories, but they were true masters at paving over their victims. But history is not constructed solely from marble statues and official court circulars. It is also made of the lives that were lived desperately in the margins. For over a century, Prince Alfred was relegated to a convenient footnote. He was casually dismissed by generations of biographers as a sickly, melancholic young man who simply lacked the constitution to thrive in a demanding world. That dismissal is the final lingering insult of the era that killed him. He did not fail to thrive. He was actively suffocated by a society that weaponized morality to maintain absolute control over its subjects, starting with its own children. When we look back at the late 19th century, it is incredibly easy to get lost in the manufactured glamour of the royal courts. We are drawn to the rapid industrial expansion, the intricate fashion, and the confident, sprawling maps of the British and German empires. But Alfred's story demands that we look at the blood beneath the floorboards. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question about the nature of legacy and the mechanics of power. What is the actual human cost of a flawless public image? In Alfred's case, the cost was total. He was a young man born into an impossible intersection of supreme privilege and profound personal vulnerability. From the moment he could walk, he was denied the basic right to an authentic identity. He sought love, release, and simple human connection in the only places his society left open to him, the shadows. And he paid the ultimate price for that fundamental human need. He was hunted by opportunistic criminals, systematically poisoned by doctors who cared more for discretion than a cure, and ultimately abandoned by parents who viewed him as a geopolitical liability. Yet when we examine the final violent days of his life without the filter of royal propaganda, a different picture emerges. We do not see a coward or a failure. We see a man who was pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. Surrounded by hundreds of people celebrating a dynasty that had brought him nothing but pain, facing the physical ravages of an incurable disease and holding the power to ruin an innocent woman's life to save his own skin. He drew a line. His suicide was not a moment of weakness. It was a dark, tragic assertion of his own agency in a life where he had never been allowed to make a single choice for himself. He refused to be a pawn any longer. He refused to infect Duchess Elsa to save his family's pride. He refused to let the blackmailers dictate his future. He took the only exit available to him in a world that had bricked up all the doors. The Victorian establishment successfully washed the blood from the succession line, but the silence they bought could not bury the tragedy forever. Alfred's erased history remains a permanent, undeniable indictment of a machine that valued a flawless public facade over human life.